The Prime Minister is hard at work on the transition and is working hard at selecting his new cabinet, and it will be a pleasure for him to reveal all of that in due course.
Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland speaking in Washington earlier today. She is the one cabinet minister who we already know will be holding on to her positions in government. And we've now learned that the rest of the Liberal cabinet will be revealed as early as October 25th, just over a month after the federal election. So what does this timeline tell us about what's happening behind the scenes, if anything? It's Thursday. I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see all of you. So we're going to get the official date tomorrow. It's likely the 25th, the 26th. Does this tell you anything about how the transition is unfolding and sort of how they're getting their agenda in shape? I'll start with you, Chantal.
Yes and no. They don't seem to be in a particular hurry, but then there are logistical or structural issues to deal with. For one, the last Quebec recount took place this week on Tuesday. And it so happens that the person who kept the seat is a Liberal female MP who could be part of the next cabinet. So if you're going to build a cabinet with parity, regional representation, it's like building a house of cards. You need to know what cards you're playing with.
Yeah, that seems reasonable, a reasonable thing. Andrew, what do you make of the time it's taking? I mean, in 2015, it took like 2 weeks, I think. And in 2019, it took more like a month.
Well, you'll recall that the reason we had to have the election was because the opposition was holding up the urgent work of government in the Commons and in the Senate. We dissolved the House, we had a summer break, we had an election, and now we're more than a month into appoint a cabinet, and who knows how much longer to recall Parliament. In the UK, the Parliament comes back in a few days after each election. Now, I grant you, the bigger country, maybe it takes give them a few more days, and maybe a few more days because our cabinets have become so elephantine. But 2 months without meeting Parliament is a little longer than it needs to be. The government of the day is supposed to be able to face Parliament on any day and command its confidence. And the longer the governments don't meet Parliament, the more they convey a certain about that.
Okay, Althea, your thoughts on it?
I don't disagree with anything Andrew said, but I think that there were a couple of logistical issues they needed to sort out. I mean, some of it is the Prime Minister's travel schedule. Some of it is the Governor General's travel schedule. Yeah. There is pressure to have, they ran on getting big things done to have, their full cabinet and Parliament resume earlier. But I think they also want to avoid mistakes of the past. And a lot of new female cabinet ministers will be new to the people around the Prime Minister. And so making sure that you do not make mistakes at the front end, I don't think is a bad thing, and I wouldn't criticize them for it. They're playing, to use Chantal's analogy, with a whole new set of cards in some ways. I know there's also, I don't know what the cabinet's going to end up looking like, but, behind the scenes, we're told that there might be some difficult discussions to be had with current cabinet ministers. Yeah. And so you want to allow that process, I think, to happen in an organic way. And the last thing I'll say is they've had issues with security clearances in the past. So that is another consideration that might explain why things are taking a little bit longer.
I feel like Toby, the dog, wants in, but Chantal wants one comment before I change topics too. Chantal.
Yeah, before Toby takes my spot here, I'm fighting for it big time. I'm more curious, to tell you the truth by now, with the timing of the return of Parliament. Parliament usually recesses the week of Remembrance Day, November 11th. If the return of Parliament is scheduled after that, I will conclude that Justin Trudeau wants to spend as little time as possible in this Parliament where he does not hold a majority. So I'm curious to see what day they pick.
Okay, and we should find that out tomorrow as well. I want to switch gears if I can. Tomorrow was supposed to be the deadline for all healthcare workers in Quebec to be fully vaccinated or be suspended without pay. They've changed that. They've backtracked. Here's what the health minister there had to say about that yesterday.
We took the difficult decision late last night, to postpone the implementation of the decree on mandatory vaccination in the health network until November 15. We want to give the unvaccinated staff extra time to collect their dose. But I want to be clear, we will apply the mandatory vaccination for healthcare workers.
The decision became to push it back because there's real concern that they would end up with not enough people to work. We're talking thousands and thousands of people. Chantal, I'll start with you on this because you're in Quebec. Is this blinking first a concern that other provinces, the federal government, should be thinking about here?
Probably less so if you're not talking about workers that are so essential to make your health system operate. So if you're in a province where you have lots of them, maybe you can afford to just not blink. In the case of Quebec, there was just no choice. Now, that being said, that's not an argument against setting a deadline for people in the healthcare system to get vaccinated, because over that period until yesterday, half of the people who were not vaccinated in the system did start or get vaccinated. Beyond that, of course, it does cost you political capital. And one of the problems with that is that moral authority is what has gotten citizens to respect a lot of guidelines. And this is one of the first big times where moral authority has failed in the face of defiance.
And that's interesting because it is in Quebec where there has been, some success in keeping that moral authority. Andrew, what did you make of the decision?
It sends a very bad signal, not just in Quebec, but to the rest of the country. It will embolden the anti-vaxxers, who we've discovered are much more numerous and much more determined than perhaps we had thought previously. The calculation, I guess, of the government of Quebec was that they were so determined they'd rather lose their jobs than get vaccinated, or at least they weren't willing to test that proposition. But I don't think there's any other word for it but blinked. Perhaps if they are sufficiently strict and determined from this point on, that the damage of that can be unwound. Maybe some combination of giving a little here and then being firmer from now on. Maybe that will work. But I would think it's going to send bad signals. And of course, they're not the only ones. If you look at the federal plan, they don't have mandatory vaccines. You have to attest that you've been vaccinated. You have to show proof. And supposedly they're going to audit all of these attestations. Well, I'll believe that when I see it.
Althea, I mean, you do have to allow, I think, for reasonable sort of uptake between when you make the threat and the deadline in hopes that works. I guess they just need longer in Quebec, and maybe that's what other governments should think about too.
Well, I'm going to split the issues up into two. I think for the federal government, the reason that they went with an attestation to begin with was because they couldn't really check everybody's vaccination status remotely, and they wanted to get things done by the deadline that they had suggested. I also don't think they're dealing with necessarily critical staff, not to disparage any of the work that federal public servants do, but they are not like life and death situations.
Not frontline workers,
like the nurses.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I do not think that this is going to make the federal government change its course, even if there are lots of people in the bureaucracy who decide not to get vaccinated. Quebec is facing, like many other provinces, but an acute staffing shortage when it comes to nurses. Like just in our region here in Ottawa, in Gatineau on the other side, there's 350 nurses that are required just to avoid having the current nurses doing overtime. Okay. So they're already dealing with a problem to begin with. And I think in some ways, it's hard to criticize a government for doing the right thing when it comes to people's health and safety. And you would want them to contingency plan. And if it takes them another month to sort out what it would mean if they have hundreds of nurses not showing up for work, then that is the wise decision. And I think that is one of the reasons why you had opposition parties in Assemblée Nationale, for example, asking the CAQ government to do this.
Okay, let's move on to one more topic. Next week, Albertans go to the polls in their municipal elections, but they will also be voting yes or no on whether Parliament and the Government of Canada's commitment to the principle of equalization payments should be removed from the Constitution. The referendum question was an election promise that Jason Kenney made. It's riveting stuff anytime we talk about equalization, but actually Chantal, Andrew, and Althea love talking about this kind of stuff. So let's do it. Andrew, what is actually going on here? Is this Jason Kenney trying to prove a political point? Is it trying to win points at a time when he needs to politically? Is there anything behind this referendum if Albertans agree with him?
Well, I mean, it's mostly a stunt. It was, I think, conceived at a time when he was more popular than he is now, when he thought he could kind of get in front of the parade, channel Albertans' frustrations with the state of their economy, with people blocking their oil, et cetera, and make a statement, shake a fist. And there is a theory in some Alberta circles that by virtue of the secession reference, where the Supreme Court discovered a constitutional duty to negotiate in the event that a province has a referendum on constitutional change. Now, you can argue that the Supreme Court was really intending that to be in the context of secession rather than constitutional change in general. But there's a theory in some Alberta quarters that if they hold this referendum and they win it, then the rest of the Canada would be duty-bound to come to the table, or at the very least would be nervous and afraid of upsetting Alberta public opinion. There's a number of flaws in that argument, one of which is they may not win the referendum. We shall see. The polling data is fragmentary. If there's anything that Albertans dislike more than equalization these days, it's Jason Kenney. And so the worry that from his standpoint may be that people show up not to vote against equalization, but to give him a black eye.
Yeah, and that'll be fascinating to see whether that happens and if that's how we should interpret it. And is this also, in your mind, Chantal, about Jason Kenney trying to position Alberta to have leverage the way Quebec does in some way?
Yes, but that was then and this is now, and I agree with Andrew. This was conceived at the time when Jason Kenney was influential and popular and had Alberta behind him. That's not the case now. If you were going to send anyone to negotiate anything with the other provinces and the federal government, it would not be the least liked premier and the most unpopular premier at home in the country. So on that particular score, any union leader will tell you that's not necessarily who you want at the table. It is still interesting because if it does pass, the federal government is going to have to respond or not respond in some way. First question, suppose it passes narrowly. Justin Trudeau has always said 50% plus one is not a clear majority. And if you're going to use the Supreme Court ruling on secession to say everyone must come to the table, it does speak of a clear majority. So interesting response there. The other question is, if you're going to accept that premise that the secession reference allows any province backed by a referendum mandate to force everyone to at least come to the table for a conversation, then you're setting a precedent that others will want to use in cases that have little to do with secession. So for people like us who are constitutional nerds of a sort, it's really interesting.
I mean, it's also interesting because you can see if Jason Kenney wasn't so weakened, how it would have been a pretty effective political trap, given what you've laid out there, Chantal. So it's only his own problems that are preventing this perhaps from playing out in a substantive way, Althea?
Yes and no. I mean, Jason Kenney has been campaigning for the last maybe decade against Justin Trudeau. So in some ways, this is entirely consistent with, one, a promise kept, and also where Mr. Kenney was going. I don't actually think it's that consequential. I would be shocked if we're talking about this in 2 weeks. If the other provinces decide that there's something in the result that they feel emboldens their case, maybe we'll be talking more about it. But I think this is, it was a promise he made. He's delivering on that promise. And whether or not Albertans actually say yes, they want to renegotiate this, I don't see the federal government spending much time talking about it.
Yeah.
We should say that the other person who might be made very uncomfortable by this, if they win, is Aaron O'Toole, because he would not want to get offside with his Western base on this issue. But on the other hand, if he enforced it, he'd have hell to pay with his MPs and candidates from Quebec and Atlantic Canada.
Maybe he should just be quiet then on Monday instead of responding in any way.
We might,
Chantal, and then Althea, then I'll wrap it up. Yeah.
We should also add that if that is the point, to renegotiate equalization, maybe that should be what the question says. Right. And it does not say that. It says to walk away from it. And second, I don't see Premier Doug Ford, with an election coming a few months down the road, suddenly engaging on a battle on equalization against the federal government.
Yeah. Last word, Althea.
Oh, just that Aaron O'Toole actually was asked this during the election campaign. maybe I even asked this question during the election campaign, and I think it was me. But anyways, his answer was that, well, that's a very interesting question, and the provinces themselves have asked to renegotiate this formula. That's where he took that conversation. So I suspect that that's probably where he will continue to take that conversation.
Take it right off his front door. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. I'll see you next week.